Edmund Burke is an unusual figure in a course on the history of philosophy because he wasn't a professional scholar, wasn't a professional academic, wasn't a man who lived the contemplative life. It makes him different from most of the figures that we've encountered so far in our series of lectures. Edmund Burke was a practical politician who was very influential in late 18th century England. He was a member of the House of Commons. He was one of the Rockingham Whigs. And he spent a long career as a practical politician actually working out the connection between political theory and political practice. Burke's primary concern in investigating political life is to find out what works in practice. And not just in practice across the world. His concern is to find out what works in practice under the circumstances of a roughly democratic legislature or a representative legislature. Burke is trying to figure out the ways in which legislatures work, the way in which the new democratic governments that have been set up during the period of the Enlightenment function, what sort of political ideals they ought to be connected with, and in addition, how political theory ought to be connected to political practice. Now, Hume is often seen, or not Hume, but Burke, is often seen as one of the most conservative thinkers of the Enlightenment, as a kind of precursor to romantic reaction. There's a certain degree of truth in that. But he's also a rather reform-minded Whig as well. Although he was against the French Revolution, he supported the ideals of the American Revolution. He investigated corrupt practices among the East India Company. He wanted to alleviate some of the oppression that was characteristic of the English treatment of Ireland, and that should come as no surprise. Burke himself grew up in Ireland. He's the product of a mixed marriage between a Protestant father and a Catholic mother. All through his political career, he's something of an outsider. He's a parvenu, someone that shows up in Commons and got there by dint of his ability, not by his lineage, not necessarily by his connections. So Burke is a practical politician. If we think of someone like Kant as being an intellectual scientist or a political scientist in the strict sense of the term, Hume can be thought of as a political engineer. He wants to take the insights of political philosophy and apply them. And his standard will be pragmatic. Does it work in practice? If it doesn't work in practice, he thinks that a theory is by definition a bad theory. So Burke is a very pragmatic thinker, a very practical man, and something of an opportunist as well. We ought to forgive him the occasional lapses in his thinking and in his writing. The heat of political polemic often causes people to go out on a limb, to overformulate an argument, to take it a little bit too far. And there's also a sense of, a certain degree of confusion in Burke's work. He's concerned with different political issues at different times, and although there's a rough consistency to his outlook, he varies and vacillates the way most politicians do. It's about the best we can expect from a man that has to live with the rough and tumble of politics every day. Now, Burke's position is that of a Whig. He's an outsider. He supports the country party as opposed to the court party. He wants to make sure that corruption doesn't dominate the English government. And he wants to make sure that no unforeseen revolutionary emergencies create the kind of desperate political situation in England that is characteristic of France during the time of the French Revolution. And he also wants to look at the origins of legitimacy, the structure of legislation, and the way in which governments can be reformed, which is part of the project of the Enlightenment, and at the same time remain stable, because reform and stability are in some respects antithetical. There's a certain degree of tension between the two. Burke recognizes the need for reform, but he also recognizes the need for political stability, for political order. Sometimes he goes for one, sometimes for the other, but my sense is that his primary emphasis is on the idea of political order. He thinks that the Hobbesian state of nature, the lapse back into lawless terror that was characteristic of the worst excesses of the French Revolution, could have been predicted, that a wise political science would have prevented the necessity for such a state of affairs, and that by empirically studying the data of history, Burke thinks that we can come to a rough empirical understanding of what human nature is in the case of individuals, and what the nature of human societies and human governments is as a matter of practical fact, empirical fact. So Hume's theory is going to be anti-utopian. It's going to move away from the tradition of thought that we got with Plato or Thomas More of creating an ideal society and judging the world around us on the basis of that. He's going to take the other tack. He's going to look at the world around us and say, at least this works. We can be sure that this has some connection to reality. It is reality. Now, our proposals for reform will have to be judged within the context of what works. Someone wants to find politics as the art of the possible. And that's very much Burke's perspective. Does it work in practice? Now, as a leader in the House of Commons, he's a noted orator. He is an indefatigable writer of pamphlets. And he knows how to manage men. He knows how to manage legislatures. He knows how to get things done. He recognizes the need for reform and pushes for reform when he thinks it's unavoidable. Reform is dangerous because there's always a certain degree of risk involved in changing the status quo. Right? That's the conservative element. But being a rational risk minimizer, Burke says that occasionally gradual, slow-moving, well-considered reforms implemented over a period of time are actually risk-reducing mechanisms because they prevent the necessity for revolutionary violence, which is the worst possible state of affairs. In other words, prior to the beginnings of the American Revolution, Burke advocates liberalizing the relationship with the American colonies. He says, give them some representation in Parliament. You are actually denying them the rights of Englishmen which had been established by the Glorious Revolution. Burke continuously harks back to the Glorious Revolution as his idea of a fine revolution. Not much happens. The change is quick, easy, bloodless. He does his best not to talk about the period of English history between 1640 and 1660, because it would give people the unpleasant impression that once in a while revolutions can't be avoided, and perhaps even the government he thinks so highly of was based upon an earlier revolution. So when he talks about revolutions of the earlier century, he's talking about the Glorious Revolution. He doesn't want to think about Cromwell. There's a little bit of a disingenuous element here. He is, after all, a practical politician, supporting Whig policies. What's more Whig than to advocate the principles of the Glorious Revolution of '89? His reason for supporting the protests of the American colonists was that their demands were within the province of the rights that had been established for Englishmen in the Glorious Revolution of 1689. And he said, look, if we don't liberalize our connection with them, and in addition, not just to the Americans, but he was also willing to liberalize his relations with India and other colonial possessions of England. He says, if we don't liberalize our connections with them, in fact, we will lose them. We will drive them to the unavoidable expedient of an enormous revolution, which will cost us men, which will cost us money, and which will ultimately cost us America. So Burke is not a reactionary in the sense that he's entirely against reform. What he is a conservative, one who wants to make reforms piecemeal, slowly. For him, as for Hume, and this is one of the connections between Burke and the entire tradition of English political and moral thought, prudence is the great virtue. If we were to distinguish between the empiricists and the idealists, or distinguish between the English-speaking philosophers and the continental rationalists, I would say that the great virtue of the English empirical philosophers is prudence. They are prudent men. They don't get carried away by either emotion or reason. They do things more or less within the bounds of common sense. The alternative virtue, which we find among the rationalistic philosophers, primarily among the German-speaking philosophers, also I would say among Plato, all metaphysicians, their great alternative virtue is ruthlessness. They take an idea as far as it can possibly go, and they say, prudence be damned. We're going to do what makes sense. We're going to do what's right, regardless of whether this is consistent with anybody's idea of common sense. Common sense, in a way, is our problem. We want to get beyond common sense to what Thoreau called something magnificently uncommon. Well, Burke doesn't want anything uncommon or magnificent. He wants something prudent, something you can count on, something that would be conservative without being reactionary. And so he's willing to make changes in political practice and in political theory, so long as they're gradual, so long as they balance out the empirical interests that are represented in the society at the moment that a particular reform is suggested, and so that we can possibly reverse any given reform, so that if it turns out to be deleterious in practice, we can say, okay, we made a mistake, we're going to revoke that attempted reform. Burke is skeptical of all utopian thoughts, of all utopian rationalistic programs for the creation of ultimate human felicity. He says, we'll do the best we can right here and now, within the parameters of what can practically be done. So he advocates certain kinds of reform. Reforms of English foreign policy, reform in the treatment of Ireland, reform in the organization of the government, and Burke also wants to reform political theory, the idea of politics, the way in which people think about politics. Burke believes, on the basis of his experience as a practical politician, that he has something worthwhile to say about that, however disdainful professional philosophers might be. And there's a certain degree of truth in that. Burke has been largely neglected by professional politicians because there are a great many inconsistencies in his work. He's not the deep, rigorous thinker that we're going to find in Hume or Kant or any of the professional scholars. Burke does advocate and does make a couple of arguments that are novel and important. His most important work is called Reflections on the Revolution in France. It is ostensibly a letter written to a young French nobleman explaining the English conservative interpretation of the French Revolution, and in particular, the interpretation of the Terror. Burke thinks that the Terror, essentially a breakdown of legal order which amounts to the law of the war of all against all, to a horrifying situation which is the worst of political circumstances, where no one has any security for property or for life, where terror reigns, where there's no predictability with regard to governmental policy, and you never know who's going to be killed next. First, Danton or Robespierre start to persecute those they suspect of having royalist sympathies. And then they get their own political enemies within the revolutionary movement, and finally their own political enemies get them and chop their heads off, because political terror is a dangerous thing. No one knows who to trust, no one knows where to go. Burke says this could have been predicted. The entire tradition of the French Enlightenment, the tradition of continental rationalism, of abstract theorizing, independent of contingent and immediate circumstances, is what leads to political fallacies, like emphasizing the imprescriptible rights of man and other abstractions, which have no immediate connection to the historical experience of French government. So Burke says all this abstract theorizing done by the professors in their studies are not only wrong, but positively dangerous. When carried into practice, the result is not improvement, it's chaos. By trying to institute what amounts to a secular millennium, by trying to end the earlier messy, ugly, evil portion of human existence and create a new, fundamentally changed social structure, which creates perfect equality and perfect liberty and perfect justice, what you get is perfectly the opposite. All utopian schemes for the immediate creation of perfection are chimerical and wrong. They're an illusion. Burke says, practice over theory. What works comes over what we would like. So what Burke says is that the terror is implicit in the French Revolution itself, and that these demands for complete change now are not only unrealistic, but dangerous, and they're the product of this abstract rationalizing that we get in the continental tradition. He thinks that people like Rousseau, with their radical democratic tendencies, their insistence, remember the beginning of Rousseau's Social Contract? Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. It's a beautiful, poetic line. Does anyone clearly understand what it means? It means that the world's bad and that lots of political stuff is evil. And Burke says, well, that may be true, but that's a very dangerous idea to introduce. We cannot make complete human liberation tomorrow, or in fact, we cannot create complete human liberation within the foreseeable future. So in practice, that's impossible. He thinks that the abstract tradition of rational inquiry that starts in French culture, I guess, with Descartes, and moves on through the tradition of the French Enlightenment, is dangerous because it neglects practicality in favor of abstract theories that have no immediate connection to historical experience. In some respects, the guillotine is the logical outcome of rationalism. It's the logical outcome of insisting that both political and moral duty comes from pure reason, rather than the collective connection of our traditions, our feelings, our sentiments, our reasonings about our traditions and feelings and sentiments. In other words, the idea that we can institute a whole new world today. I think someone once said that the guillotine is a very Cartesian sort of an instrument because it separates the mind and the body so completely. Well, I think Burke would sympathize with that kind of a view. He says, look, the French have a legitimate set of objections to the kind of government they have. An absolute monarchy is an evil thing. Divine right despotism, divine right monarchies are a mistake. They're a relic of the feudal past. These ought to be gotten rid of. The domination of the church in French political affairs is, Burke thinks, an evil. The hereditary nobility and the particular legal and institutional advantages that they have, at least some of those for Burke are evil. But he says, look, all of these grievances could be redressed, but they can be redressed only one at a time and only gradually. The idea of killing the king and then killing all the nobles and then killing all the people who dispute within the Radical Democratic Party and then starting to kill each other is what you would expect from people that have no connection to their earlier traditions. Because it's tradition, sentiment, a kind of intellectual inertia that keeps society together. Society is not held together by rationality. People normally do not sit down, do some mathematical problems, and conclude that they love their family, that they love their country, that they like their hometown. People are essentially creatures of sentiment. This connects it back up to the Humean tradition of moral theory. This connects it to the skeptical tradition of epistemology that comes out of Locke and empiricism and things like that. So Hume, while he's not, or Burke, while he's not a professional philosopher, is well within the central trend, the skeptical, empirical, gradual, sentimental trend of English thought. Now, he thinks that the advantages of the English Constitution is that it's a gradual accumulation of practices and traditions which minimize the need for revolution and which could be gradually reformed from within. And one of the great advantages of the English Constitution is that it's not written down. It's a general kind of nebulous collection of traditions and practices and sentiments. And the advantage of that is that it can change gradually and imperceptibly. It gives you the sense of continuity over time. Burke thinks that very important. He thinks that the English Constitution is an entailed inheritance, as he puts it. We inherit a system of government and a society from our ancestors, and it is an entailed inheritance. You can't just throw it all out. You can't get rid of it all at once. So Burke says the real problem with the French Revolution is that it wasn't a gradual series of reforms. It wasn't based empirically on the traditions of the French ways of life and French government. The problem with it is that it comes from abstract theorizing, which is downright dangerous. Now, Burke supported the American Revolution because he felt that the American colonists had been forced, in defense of their Whig liberties, to have, grudgingly, a revolution. And he said, I told you so, in a way the English government had it coming. He thinks that the French government has it coming too because they're also unwilling to make reforms. But he says the revolutionaries are actually worse than the government they already had. While we may have had oppression under an absolute monarch, we have terror under a revolution. And what we could reasonably expect to come out of this revolution is something like a Caesar, some sort of despotic figure that will dominate this age of chaos and create order at the price of all the liberties that everyone had prior to the revolution. In other words, he anticipates something like Napoleon. Not a bad anticipation. Again, the practical politician can see what the likely outcome of chaos in real life is going to be. So his criticism of the French Revolution is what he's mostly remembered for, and that's where he gets the name of being a great reactionary. It's not fair to call him a reactionary. The true label, the appropriate label, would be conservative. He doesn't oppose all reforms. He doesn't want to go back to feudalism, but he wants to make sure that these reforms are slow and gradual. In some respects, that makes him out of step with the Enlightenment. It certainly makes him out of step with the Enlightenment as it's existing on the continent. The French and German traditions are very rigorous and absolute and abstract. He's more or less consistent with the Enlightenment as it happens in England. Hume would understand Burke. Both of them are rational risk minimizers. Think about what the implications are of empiricism for political theory. Let's take Hume's empiricism, but we could take any of them. What is an empiricist sure of? Well, nothing. Empiricism is basically a skeptical philosophy. They're not really sure of anything. What do they kind of bank on if they're not absolutely certain? Because certainty is something we study with guys like Descartes. Humeans don't get certain, they just get comfortable. Well, what sort of things can you be comfortable with? Can you have a reasonable belief in? Well, you can believe in what you see and what you have experienced with. And what do we have experience with? The brute facts of human history. In other words, the empiricist is always going to say, well, we can at least be reasonably certain that if we continue on the way we're going, that the future will be roughly speaking like the past, because we notice certain regularities in the world around us. So if monarchy has been in England for the past 200 or 300 or 400 or 500 years, as long as we don't rock the boat too much, the empiricist says we can reasonably expect that we'll have a continuity between the earlier forms and the later forms. In other words, we can expect more of the same. It's not perfect, but at least we can be sure of that. Who knows what will happen if we make fundamental changes immediately? You can't be certain of that. So what it means is, I think that empiricism is intrinsically skeptical and, in addition, intrinsically conservative. Skepticism is intrinsically conservative because the skeptic is going to say to every would-be reformer, what grounds do I have to believe that your reform is going to work? And what will we be able to tell him? If it's existed in the past, well, then we'll have some good grounds. But many of the political reforms, and the most praiseworthy and important political reforms of the Enlightenment, were things that had never happened in the past. And here's the problem. An empiricist, which is a skeptical kind of philosopher, is always going to have some misgivings about even the most attractive reforms because we lack good grounds to expect that they're going to work, because we have no practice, we have no experience with them. And since innovation entails risk, and risk is dangerous and undermines, at least potentially, human felicity, the rational thing to do is to oppose, or at least to regulate and make gradual political reforms, because that regulates and moderates the risk, and the rational minimization of risk is in a way what empiricism is all about. You don't know what's going to happen if you haven't tried it yet. So if you're going to propose a reform, well, then the bigger the reform is, the more risk involved, the more danger it is, the more salutary skepticism might be. The people who advocate radical, complete, ultimate reform in the political theory of the Enlightenment are all rationalists. None of them are empiricists. And that's not an accident. Dogmatism is connected to rationalism. Remember when I talked about Kant last time? Rationality, the willingness to ruthlessly pursue the implications of one idea. As Kierkegaard said, purity of the heart is the will to one thing. The willingness to take one idea ruthlessly to its logical consequences, that's characteristic of continental rationalism. And the consequences of that in terms of political science is saying all oppression is evil. It's in the Enlightenment that we start to see people begin to object to things like slavery. They begin to object to things like the oppression of women. They begin to object to ideas like the extermination and genocidal treatment of the Indians or non-Western peoples. These ideas are new. We have plenty of experience with the oppression of women. We have lots of experience with slavery. It's existed all throughout the world, throughout most of human history. Innovation in a matter so great and profound as the status of women, or as is in the case of the abolition of slavery, is going to strike an empiricist as being a very dangerous set of changes. Why? Well, what experience do we have with equality between men and women? None. Well, who knows what's going to happen then? And the problem is that that's true. It gives us something to think about. I don't know that it's a good reason not to do it. As a matter of fact, the most important breakthroughs in the political theory of the Enlightenment are, like it or not, dogmatic one way or another. A skeptic would have good reasons for objecting to them, or at least having some misgivings about them. So Burke's position is that of a skeptical empiricist. And he says, show me, do we have good reason to believe this is going to work? And if we don't, well then, let's not do it. Or if we're going to do it, if the political force that advocates change is so powerful that you can't avoid it, let's do it gradually. Let's do it piecemeal. Let's do it in one place, one county, or one city to start out. Let's have essentially a pilot program. Here in Washington, when we establish a pilot program, when we test something out, we're essentially adopting a position of Burkean conservatism. And this is not an irrational thing to do. Consider the example of something like prohibition. It's with reforms that turn out not to work, that turn out not to be very practical, where Burkean conservatism comes into its own. Imagine somebody coming up with an idea that if we made it illegal to drink alcohol in the United States, we could reduce drunk driving, we could reduce fetal alcohol syndrome, we could reduce all kinds of evil things. And I think that any sensible person looking at the bad consequences of alcoholism, would say that it would be fine to get rid of those things. But Burke will say, wait a minute. Although your theory tells us that it would be good to get rid of these things, and in fact, I'm inclined to agree with you. Being a sentimental guy, I think that drunk driving is a bad thing. But in practice, can we do this? And that's, for Burke and for Burkean conservatives, the key question. Will it work in practice? How are you going to make everybody stop drinking alcohol? How are you going to prevent alcohol from coming in across the border? How are you going to prevent the rise of organized crime? Are the consequences of this reform going to be worse than the evils you seek to eliminate? Will you, in fact, be able to eliminate these evils simply by passing a law? Can you control reality at that level? And Burke would say, I don't think you can. I've seen how people relate to alcohol. I think the chances of you getting America to actually go dry are really quite limited. Well, it turns out after making the experiment, the reformers have to eat their words. In this case, we have reform that is appealing at the level of theory, seems like a good idea, but in practice we can't make it work. Well, this is the strong point of Burkean conservatism. There are certain kinds of issues, certain kinds of reforms that turn out not to work very well in practice. Burke tells us before we institute a reform to be reasonably certain that it's going to work in practice. And the only way you can do that is by actually testing it empirically. Don't tell me that you have a theory and a graph that shows that drunk driving goes to 0 the year after we institute prohibition. It just doesn't happen that way. It's a lovely theory, but I don't judge the world on the basis of theories. I judge the world on the basis of the way the world works. There is a certain degree of kind of homey practicality to Burke. That's the attractiveness of this guy. Here's the downside of it, and I think it's an important downside. All the great moral advances in political life that have happened in the modern age have been unprecedented. The abolition of slavery, you can't imagine a more dogmatic or a more improbable drive, and comes out of the Enlightenment. Prior to the Enlightenment, slavery had existed all over the world, and it has existed for 20, 30, 40, 50 centuries. Now, if you're an empiricist and somebody says that what I'd like to do is abolish slavery on a global basis and make everyone free, well, Burke is going to say about that the same thing he said about prohibition, only in spades and much more emphatically, because this project of abolishing slavery, of creating universal human freedom, is obviously the kind of thing some Germans thought up. Englishmen don't think up stuff like that, unless, of course, they're moved by religious piety as opposed to skeptical empirical philosophy. So Burke would say, and this is not an irrational thing to say, that there are many potential dangers, even in such a praiseworthy project as the abolition of slavery, the equality of women, the shortening of the workday, the extension of voting rights. Burke was very strongly against the democratization of politics. He certainly did not want to extend the franchise on the basis of one man, one vote. He says, do we have any experience with that? Well, yes, we do. We have stories in our histories about democracy. If you are familiar with Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars, well, in that, when we look at the results of Athenian democracy, it was disastrous, and it was the actual inability of Athenian democracy to make intelligent decisions that causes them to lose the Peloponnesian Wars. Alcibiades, who says, let's go invade Syracuse, and the people really like it. And democracy says that, yes, we'll go do this because the people are very aroused by it. It's disastrous, they lose the war, and the culture is destroyed. Now, for the empiricist, for the skeptic, for the conservative, there's a moral there. Democracy, the democratization of politics, regardless of whether the categorical imperative says you have to, regardless of whether Rousseau likes it or not, regardless of whether continental thinkers are going to approve of you, makes no difference. The democratization of politics is downright dangerous, and in some respects it's more dangerous than the abolition of slavery because that hasn't been tried before. We've tried democracy before. It's a blasted disaster. So what Burke likes is whatever we happen to have. And this is going to be true of every conservative. If you're a Burkean conservative by kind of outlook or inclination, if you get born in Japan in feudal ages, you're going to think that feudal Japan is a terrific set of institutions as well. There's a certain sort of piety about what you were raised with in Burke's ideas, which he gives a kind of philosophical formulation to. So the upside of Burkean conservatism is that it restricts us from doing implausible, impractical kinds of reform. The downside of it is that it prevents us from making salutary reforms, and that, to be honest, there's a sort of timidity to it. which I think, I don't know, passes for wisdom, but is often just timidity, which is often just a fear of taking a chance. Rational risk minimization is a good thing, and I must confess prudence is a virtue. My point in suggesting that there are limitations to this is that prudence is not the only virtue, and that taken to an extreme, it may be that prudence is sometimes a vice. Prudence has no understanding and no appreciation of the heroic virtues that attach to ruthlessness. Ruthlessness allows for great virtue and great vice. Burke limits what we might call the standard deviation of virtue and vice. We don't get too bad, we don't get too good. We have more or less kind of what we had before. Maybe we can make things a little bit better, but don't get out of hand about this. That's really dangerous. Don't get enthusiastic. Be prudent. Burke counsels us to prudence, and I think that prudence is sometimes a vice as well as being a virtue. That's the difficulties with this. Now, in addition, there are two more contributions that Burke makes to political science, which are departures from the earlier political conceptions, characteristic of both the English and the French Enlightenment. And in addition to that, they are things that are still with us today one way or another, ideas that have been introduced that are quite important. The first and most important idea that Burke comes up with is the idea that political parties are not only legitimate, but necessary. Yesterday, somebody happened to ask me about political parties. Well, here's your answer. In the ancient political tradition, parties are the extreme, superlative form of faction, and faction is understood to be intrinsically evil. All of political theory in the ancient world, it doesn't matter whether it's Platonic or Aristotelian or Roman or Greek, is all organized around the problem of preventing society from breaking up into antagonistic factions. We want a unity of sentiment, a unity of purpose which characterizes the good polis. Now, if we look back at history, we have good reason for believing that. Faction, party, leads to civil war in our understanding of history, or at least in the understanding of history characteristic of 18th century England. Look back at Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars, right? The revolution at Corcyra, the civil wars that are detailed in there, all proceed from the breaking up of society into antagonistic factions who define their interest oppositely. A virtuous individual will be public-spirited, will have no separation of their interest from the interest of society as a whole. That's why the Platonic guardian class is not allowed to have their own family and is not allowed to have their own private property, because that would give them a special, particular interest independent of the interest of the society as a whole. By reducing them to no other interests except the interest of the city as a whole, it prevents, at least in Plato's mind, the emergence of the guardians of the gold class as a faction with separate interests and a separate agenda independent of what's good for the society as a whole. Now, that idea that faction and party are intrinsically evil, a sign of disease within a society, and potentially which will potentially result in a civil war, which means back to the state of nature, the war of all against all. This idea is taken up, that factions and parties are bad, and it comes right into political theory, and it goes at least as far as Hume. Hume is the first political thinker in his political essays. I think this is the essay on the ideal commonwealth where it brings this up. He kind of wants to allow for the idea of legitimate opposition, which is what parties do. They make it possible to focus and organize opposition to the government and to the dominant party. And at the same time, he wants to avoid the dangerous element of faction and party because he thinks it potentially could lead to civil war. The gist of it is something like this, that the idea of legitimate political parties, of a loyal opposition, of legitimate dissent, is a peculiarly modern idea, and Burke helps us legitimize that idea. Think about the ancient world and the medieval world. In the ancient and medieval world, a government legitimized itself by reference to the will of God or of ultimate rationality in the case of the Platonic ideal city, or with reference to some set of myths that legitimized the king. Divine right monarchy is the best example of this. Why do you have to obey the king when he tells you to do something? Because he's God's friend, or he's God's chosen, he's God's electors. He has some special connection to God that differs from you. And there's a hierarchy. If you remember Aquinas, we've got the God up here and the angels, and then the king here, and down below him are the nobles, and below them are people like you. And the reason why you have to obey people that are higher in the hierarchy is God made the hierarchy that way. If you tell the king you don't like his laws, if you tell the king you're opposed to his policies, you're essentially opposed to the king. And if you're opposed to the king, you're opposed to God. And if you're opposed to God, you're opposed to morality and virtue and goodness. And that means you're a friend of Satan and should be killed. What that means is that in the ancient political tradition, it moves all the way up to the medieval age, the idea of legitimate dissent never comes up. Dissent is by definition evil since the government is backed by God. When we move into the modern world, social contractarianism, an idea of political legitimacy which says that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the people, who allegedly get together in the state of nature and form the social contract and all that jazz. Well, when that becomes possible, then that means that there's no divine sanction for the government, and one way or another, we are going to have to make possible the idea of legitimate dissent, of a loyal opposition, because it means that people who think governmental policy is mistaken are not children of the devil. It just means they have a different opinion. That can't happen until the secularization of politics, and that can't happen until the Enlightenment. What that means then is that, first of all, the idea of a loyal opposition, of legitimate dissent, is an immensely sophisticated thought. It is a peculiarly modern thought, and it needs certain adjustments in our political theory, particularly since we now have representative legislatures. It is necessary for us to be able to organize people that support governmental policy and people who are opposed to it so that we can effectively legislate, or at least obstruct legislation, within the legislature itself. In other words, the rise of representative legislatures and the rise of human, man-centered political theory means that we're also going to have the rise, first of all, of legitimate dissent and loyal opposition, and also it means the rise of legitimate political parties, which are not seen as being a threat to the state, but rather seen as being the natural condition of human beings who intrinsically have different perspectives on the world. So once politics is sanctioned only by the will of the people, then legitimate dissent has to be made room for, because it's a simple empirical fact. And if it's a simple empirical fact, then the older tradition, which says that all parties and all factions are evil, has to be gotten rid of. Now, Hume starts to do that when he creates what's called the Court of Competitors in that essay on the ideal commonwealth. He wants to take potentially factious members, potentially powerful opponents of the government, and give them a limited kind of negative supervisory role in the government. What's he doing there? He's trying to create the idea of a legitimate opposition. It's a brilliant thought. But also, if you look at Hume's political essays, he constantly says that we have to avoid faction, we have to avoid party. That could create a civil war, and we all know from history that that's a very bad thing. So Hume is something between the ancient tradition of political theory and the modern enlightened political theory, which says that there'll be a diversity, a plurality of ideas and voices. Hume is halfway between the two. Burke, remarkably enough, is the first man to say that political parties are not only desirable, but they are necessary because you can't run a legislature without them. And how did he find that out? He spent most of his career in a legislature as one of the Rockingham Whigs. And he maintained party discipline, and he said, not only is this not a bad thing, but I have no idea how you theorists would run a legislature without it. And as a matter of fact, since you theorists have no clue as to how to run a legislature, because none of you have left the library, let me tell you how legislatures really run in practice. And then what I want you folks to do is create a theory which allows for this, because practice comes first. That practical, English, empirical approach to the world around us. He says, look, I know a lot about legislatures. I spent 30 years there. So rather than me reading your French text about how all legislatures should work if you were to make yourself consistent with absolute reason or something along those lines, it says, this is the way they work in practice. You create a theory which accounts for that. That's called a scientific approach to politics, as opposed to what he views as essentially a theological approach to politics. And he says, look, if we're going to be scientific, this is the way legislatures work. You can't make them work without political parties. And since we haven't had a civil war in England, and since there's no sedition attached to this political party, not only should we acknowledge them, we should say that they're legitimate, and we shouldn't be afraid to say that I'm a Whig or I'm a Tory. And that's a great breakthrough. It's the triumph of theory, of practice over theory, and that's a typically English idea. One more thing, and then I'll close on Burke. Burke is also known for his theory of representation. He offers the idea, and this is again one of the throwbacks, I would say, to the older idea that there's a unified, public-spirited approach to politics. He says that there are two ideas of representation, what we will call virtual representation and actual representation. And he supports the idea of virtual as opposed to actual representation. Here's the thought. A virtual representative is one who takes instruction from the people who elected him, and he does exactly what they want. In other words, he represents the will of his constituency. What that means is that if the people that elected you want a policy and you think it's a mistake, well, then you do what they think as opposed to what you think, because you are there as a representative of the people. You actually represent their will. This is a kind of naively democratic idea. Burke thinks it's a mistake because he has a partiality to hierarchical political theory. He doesn't think everybody's equally smart or equally virtuous or equally wise. And there's a strong element of a kind of disdain for the average common man. He refers in the Reflections of the Revolution of France to the swinish multitude. Now, we don't hear any of our politicians talk that way, and it's not an accident. All right? They don't talk about the swinish multitude. Burke does. And he says, look, I'm not taking orders from the swinish multitude. I mean, hell, I got elected to the House of Commons in a rotten borough. The Marquis of Rockingham talked to one of his pals who was a peer and voted me in on the basis of one vote. Here I come. I'm in Parliament now. Eventually, he manages to win a seat from Bristol on his own merits. He actually has a real free election. And he eventually gets bounced out of his seat at Bristol, kicked out of a popularly elected position in Commons, because he writes a letter to his electors in Bristol and says, look, you folks are under the misapprehension that I'm interested in what you think. No, I'm not an actual representative. I'm a virtual representative. A virtual representative is one who thinks about what is good for the nation as a whole. He doesn't represent London or Manchester or Bristol or any particular locality or any particular group of people. He represents the whole interests of society judged from the large perspective. So what that means is that if we had a system of virtual representation here, that senators from Kansas and Iowa wouldn't be particularly interested in farm subsidies. Senators from New York and New Jersey wouldn't be particularly interested in mass transit. People with representatives from particular areas would not be so much interested in particular local issues as they would be in what's good for the society as a whole. There's a certain degree of plausibility in that. You can imagine that this would give honest, conscientious legislators a rather broader perspective than they often have, and perhaps they'd be less obsessively concerned with re-election, although I'm not so sure about that. The difficulty with it is that it is essentially undemocratic. What it means is that the virtual representative believes himself to be essentially nature's aristocrat, believes that he's smarter than the people that voted for him, and says, look, I really don't want your advice. I know what's best, or at least I'm doing my best to figure out what we ought to do, and I'm going to vote that way. I'm going to vote my conscience. And frankly, I have access to more information. I know what the inside dirt is on everybody that's proposing these things, and I know what the actual practical capacities of the legislature are. So, folks, trust me, I'm going to vote the way I think rather than the way you think, because I'm a lot smarter than you are. Now, he doesn't quite add in the last, but it's implicit, and the voters of Bristol managed to figure it out, and he got bounced in the election after he gave them that information about the fact that he was a virtual representative. That didn't hurt him in terms of political party affiliation or in terms of membership in the House of Commons. He finds himself a rotten borough and gets voted back in by the Rockingham Whigs. I mean, he understands how politics works. He's something of an opportunist, but that's the downside of what I think is a desirable pragmatism in his political philosophy. He's an engineer and not a scientist. He wants to know, how does it work in practice? I'm not otherwise interested in your theory. Burke, in that respect, is the most philosophical of the practical politicians of the 18th century, and a worthy heir to the English, skeptical, empirical, practical tradition of politics and philosophy.